Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 85 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today's episode is another solo episode. A couple of weeks ago, I asked my followers for any questions they'd like me to answer in a future episode. I've done this twice before for episodes 55 and 77. I got quite a few great questions and spent the past few days researching and preparing the answers. So today I'm going to respond to 4 of the questions I received via Instagram. If you enjoy this kind of episode, then make sure you follow me on Instagram at Spycraft101 and watch for another story post sometime soon for your chance to have one of your own questions answered in a future episode. But before we dive into these amazing stories, I want to tell you all about my favorite fragrance for daily wear. It's called Novichok by Clandestine Laboratories. Novichok is distinctive and combines notes of cocoa powder, chocolate almond tort, rose, jasmine, cinnamon, tonka bean, Peru balsam, and musk tonkin. Unlike some of the other colognes I've worn in the past, I've found that Novichok stays with me all day, which was a pleasant surprise. If the name sounds familiar to you, then you might already know why I was so happy to find this company and support them. The name itself comes from the very well-known Russian nerve agent Novichok, which has been used in recent years in several assassination attempts, which I've covered here on the podcast in previous episodes. The name is spelled differently, but rest assured, once you put this on, you'll still make a killer impression wherever you go. Novichok is made in small batches by Clandestine Laboratories and, like their entire lineup, is available only via direct order. If you're not sure which of their fragrances is right for you, you can also check out the Discovery Stash, 6 different mini bottles at one great price, which is perfect for finding your signature scent. So make sure to check them out either via a link in the show notes of this episode, at their website, clandestinelaboratories.com, or on Instagram at Clandestine Laboratories. Have you ever wanted to know how you'd perform in combat operations? Have you ever wanted to feel what it's like to operate in the shadows conducting espionage? Centurion Combat Simulations is running one of their biggest events, so now is your chance. Operation Condor will be held at the Muscatatuck Urban Training Center near Butlerville, Indiana from March 10th through 12th, 2023. You'll join one of 5 factions fighting within the largest urban combat training facility in the United States. The deadline for entry is March 5th, 2023. So enlist at joincenturion.com before then. The first question came from a follower who wishes to remain anonymous, who asked me to discuss the tapping of undersea communication cables for Operation Ivy Bells during the Cold War. This was primarily a mission between the U.S. Navy and the National Security Agency, and it was certainly one of the most ambitious and technically advanced missions of that entire period, in my opinion. Ivy Bells began because of the potential for an intelligence payoff that was practically off the charts. The planners at the Office of Naval Intelligence knew that the most sensitive communications would go through hardwired phone lines rather than any kind of wireless or radio signal, since those were much more easily intercepted, even if they were encrypted and impossible to break. They also reasoned that there were probably cables that ran from a Soviet submarine base on the far east coast along the ocean floor of the Sea of Okhotsk all the way to Vladivostok, where the Soviet Pacific Fleet headquarters was located. If they could locate and tap these cables without alerting the Soviets, then they could potentially collect some incredibly valuable intelligence, including reports on missile tests which took place in the region, and the readiness status of the Soviet Navy, upcoming training exercises, and who knew what else. There was only one submarine in the U.S. Navy's entire fleet at that time that could perform this kind of mission, which had never been done before. That was the USS Halibut, designated as a, quote, special projects boat, unquote. The Halibut was one of the most unusual subs ever designed. She was commissioned in 1959 as the U.S. Navy's first ever ballistic missile submarine. She was fitted to launch Regulus 1 and Regulus 2 guided missiles, which launched diagonally from a launch hangar in front of the sail. These enormous nuclear-capable missiles necessitated a cavernous space from which to be raised and launched, and could only be fired from the ocean surface. After commissioning, the Halibut patrolled the northern Pacific Ocean, awaiting her primary mission, the destruction of the Soviet naval base at Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. She and her sister submarines, therefore, led the first ever deterrence patrols, which would become a hallmark of Cold War nuclear tensions. But by the mid-1960s, the Regulus missiles had been leapfrogged by the far more potent and capable Polaris 1 ballistic missiles, which had the added benefit of being launched from underwater, which protected the submarines from detection prior to launch. The Halibut could carry 5 of the Regulus 1 missiles, or just 2 of the larger Regulus 2 missiles, compared to 16 Polaris 1 missiles carried by other newer submarines. So the Halibut was subsequently repurposed for covert activities in the mid-1960s. A 2-year, $70 million retrofit began in 1965. The enormous onboard missile hangar was refitted with a state-of-the-art, at the time, 24-bit UNIVAC computer and workshop, which became known as the Batcave, which allows scientists on board to launch and control undersea drones. A pressure chamber mounted near the rudder was designed to resemble a Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle, but was actually living quarters for the divers who would need to get down on the ocean floor to install the cable taps. This was an especially clever move because one of the most unusual and highly visible aspects of the sub could easily be explained away with a simple cover story about a rescue vehicle. The divers for Operation Ivy Bells could stay in the pressure chamber in between dives, breathing a newly developed gas mixture which was much more suitable for work deep underwater. That way, they only needed to depressurize at the end of the mission instead of after every dive. Once the Office of Naval Intelligence got the go-ahead to begin the mission in 1970, they first had to locate the cables themselves. The Sea of Okhotsk covered 611,000 square miles, and these cables would probably be just 5 inches wide. The method that they used to search for the cables is just absolutely mind-blowing to me, not because it involves some kind of high-tech device or anything like that, but because of how simple it was. The Halibut just entered the Sea of Okhotsk and moved as close to the coastline as they possibly could, and then used their periscope to look for signs in Russian on the beach, warning passerbys not to dig there because of the presence of a buried cable. These same kinds of signs are found all over the United States, and sure enough, they marked the location where the cables entered the Sea of Okhotsk as well. After that, it was easy enough to find the cable further out at sea using the Halibut's drones, which were equipped with video and still cameras. Once they found a suitable location where the divers could work undetected, they were able to exit their habitat and quickly connect a tap around the cable. This particular kind of tap was recorded to tape reels and picked up the audio via induction. So once it was removed, there would be no sign of cutting or drilling into the cable itself. They left the tap on long enough to get audio samples that proved the concept was viable, then removed it and returned to the Halibut. Once the cable tap mission was complete, the sub performed a secondary mission, which was also important, but was primarily its cover for action in the area. Most of the sailors aboard the Halibut were told the mission was to retrieve debris from an SSN-12 sandbox anti-ship missile, which had crashed into the Sea of Okhotsk nearby. In fact, the divers were able to complete this cover mission so successfully that the debris collected allowed analysts back in the U.S. to reverse engineer the sandbox missile and learn more about its capabilities and limitations. After they returned to the U.S., a much longer and longer-term operation was planned, and it was finally given the name Ivy Bells. An enormous device was developed and built at Bell Laboratories by engineers and technicians who already worked with undersea communications cables. The device was a 20-foot-long cylinder which weighed 6,000 pounds. It held a huge amount of tape so that it could be left in place for an entire year, recording the entire time. And believe it or not, it was powered through a, quote, form of nuclear power, unquote, which is something I have a hard time wrapping my head around. It could also record 20 different lines at once for NSA to separate electronically later on. The Halibut went out to the cables a second time and installed the giant new tap without any problems. The divers even grabbed an enormous spider crab from the ocean floor and brought it back for a celebratory dinner on board. Afterwards, the sub returned again a few weeks later to pick up the tapes and take them back to the U.S. The take from these recordings was beyond anyone's expectations. Conversations were overheard about defects in the Yankee-class submarines, which might allow the Americans to locate them. They learned about upcoming patrol schedules, logistics problems at various units and commands, and lots of personal calls between sailors and their mothers or wives. The Soviets were completely confident in the security of their communications and sent many sensitive messages unencrypted via these undersea cables, which further simplified things for intelligence analysts back in the United States. The operation was a complete success and continued from 1971 until 1981. The Soviets eventually learned of the operation from Ronald Pelton, a turncoat formerly employed by the NSA. He walked into their embassy in 1980 to sell secrets after falling into debt. As a reward for compromising the decade-long multi-million-dollar operation, Pelton was paid $35,000 by the Soviets. Pelton's second handler within the Soviet embassy was KGB agent Gennady Vasilenko, who himself would be imprisoned by the Russian government decades later on suspicion of being a CIA asset and traded back to the United States in 2010. 5 years later, after Ronald Pelton first betrayed his country, Vitaly Yurchenko, the KGB officer who first met with Pelton, defected to the United States and revealed his treachery to the FBI. You might remember that my guest for episode 66, Raymond Batvanis, was the special agent in charge of this investigation. Pelton served nearly 30 years in prison for his crimes and just passed away a few weeks ago, as a matter of fact, as of this recording. As for the Halibut, she continued to serve with distinction as one of the most unusual submarines ever assigned to the U.S. Navy's fleet. She was decommissioned in 1976 and eventually salvaged in 1994. You can read a lot more about the Halibut and many other incredible Navy operations in the book Blind Man's Bluff by Christopher Drew and Sherry Sontag. It's my primary source for this information and a fantastic read if you've got any interest whatsoever in undersea operations. The next question came from Blanca Fernandez in Madrid, Spain, who asked that I discuss Operation Mincemeat, a very famous intelligence operation which took place in and around Spain during World War II. It involved the corpse of Glender Michael, a homeless Welshman who unknowingly took part in one of the greatest deception operations in history. Operation Mincemeat was conceived in January 1943 by two young officers assigned to Section 17M of British intelligence. The idea was to convince the Axis powers that the Allies were planning to invade Greece in the summer of 1943 rather than the island of Sicily. To convince the Abwehr, they needed a believable method for passing fake classified information to Germany. Their chosen method was stunning in its audacity and its cleverness. British intelligence decided to deploy a cadaver off the coast of Spain so that it could be discovered by Spanish authorities. The cadaver would appear to be a military courier traveling with sensitive documents. But to pull off such an operation, they would first need to find a suitable corpse. No easy task, even in the middle of a world war. Ewan Montague, the Royal Navy officer who led the operation, contacted a London coroner who would alert him when a suitable candidate was found. Soon, Glender Michael was brought to the facility. He had been found close to death inside a warehouse, having eaten poisoned bread left out for the warehouse rats. He was selected when he died in a hospital 2 days later, and no one came to claim his body. The cadaver was dressed as a British military courier and given the fictional identity of Captain William Martin. His personal belongings included a pair of love letters and a photo of his fiancée Pam, along with other miscellaneous items that a man might normally be carrying, such as cigarettes, matches, a book of stamps, and a silver cross. The rat poison he had ingested had caused Michael's lungs to fill with fluid, which added evidence that he had died by drowning after a plane crash in the Atlantic.
We'll be right back.
When was the last time you delved into the world of Australian agriculture? It's as diverse as it is professional, as it is captivating.
Growing marron definitely runs in my veins.
AgriFutures On Air shines a light on the developments in ag science,
Bluegreen aphids, like the mosquitoes of the plant world.
rural communities, and national challenges and opportunities.
They've got so many people around to help the young farmer get up and going.
Treat yourself and join us on AgriFutures On Air, wherever you get your podcasts.
A briefcase that they attached to his belt carried the document that was crucial to the success of the operation and perhaps even to the invasion of Sicily itself. It was a memorandum from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Sir Harold Alexander of the 18th Army Group in North Africa. The memorandum advised General Alexander that he would be receiving additional reinforced units for the planned invasion of Greece. Michael's body was transported to the southern coast of Spain near the town of Huelva by the submarine HMS Seraph, where it was interred in the sea after the reading of a psalm from the Bible. Spanish authorities recovered Michael's body the very same day it was released, and the documents in the locked briefcase were soon shared with the German Abwehr, who took them at face value. The result was a repositioning of German forces to meet the perceived threat to the Balkans. By the time other evidence pointed convincingly to the pending invasion of Sicily, it was too late to move forces around again. Sicily fell to the Allies more quickly than anticipated and with fewer casualties than feared. Italy's fascist Prime Minister Benito Mussolini was outed, and his successor entered into secret talks with the Allies. Operation Mincemeat was a complete and total success. Although it was planned and put into action in 1943, the concept for the operation originated 4 years earlier in a memorandum signed by Britain's Director of Naval Intelligence, Admiral John Godfrey. This memorandum laid out a variety of options for future deception operations, one of which was the positioning of a corpse in the water carrying fake classified documents. Although Admiral Godfrey was the signatory, it is believed that the actual memorandum was written by his assistant, Lieutenant Ian Fleming, who went on to write the James Bond series of novels. Fleming later on would base the character of M, the head of MI6, on Admiral Godfrey himself, and the character of Miss Moneypenny on Mrs. Victoria Evelyn Bennett, who not only served as his secretary during the war, but participated in Mincemeat by writing the 2 love letters from Pam, Major Martin's fictional fiancée. Glenda Michael's remains were buried with honors in the cemetery of Nuestra Señora de Soledad in Huelva, where they can be found to this day. Every day, you're under attack, whether you realize it or not. Your digital devices contain your entire life, your finances, your conversations with friends and family, your interests, and even your movements. And all of that is vulnerable to an ever-expanding class of criminals, scam artists, hackers, and even governments. You don't want to leave your data security entirely in the hands of your ISP or anyone else for that matter. It's up to you to protect yourself using a multi-layered defense strategy. Silent offers you the protection you need to keep your data and devices secure from wireless threats. Their multi-shield technology blocks cellular signals, GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, EMP, RFID, NFC, and more. Silent's lineup includes everything from signal-blocking wallets all the way up to 40 cubic liter Faraday duffel bags. When you're geared up with Silent, you'll be truly disconnected, undetectable, untraceable, and unhackable. And you can now use the discount code Spycraft101 to save 10% off your order from Silent. Find them at slnt.com. The next question comes from Michael R., who asked about the role that Japanese Americans played in the Pacific Theater during World War II. I'm sure that most of my listeners are already well aware of this, but for the few that are not, after the Japanese Navy attacked the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7, 1941, most of the ethnic Japanese population of the United States, particularly on the West Coast, were rounded up and placed in internment camps for the duration of the war. This has been a very hotly debated topic ever since then, as many people see it as a terrible human rights violation, while others see it as a wartime necessity to prevent sabotage or guerrilla warfare within the United States while it engaged in a two-front war with the Axis powers. There were around 120,000 people who were interned between 1942 and 1945, and the majority of them were U.S. citizens who had not been accused of or convicted of any crime. You might be surprised to learn that despite this, thousands of Japanese Americans served honorably during the war and made enormous contributions to the eventual victory. The best known are probably the members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a segregated unit made up entirely of Japanese Americans, most of whom were from the Hawaiian Islands. The 442nd fought in the European theater and distinguished itself as one of the most decorated units in American military history. But lots of Japanese Americans also served in the Pacific theater, primarily as interpreters. A person born in the U.S. to Japanese parents is known as Nisei, and even before the U.S. declared war on Japan, there were around 3,000 of them already serving in the armed forces. And although the actual attack on Pearl Harbor came as a surprise, virtually everyone knew in the months leading up to it that war with Japan was on the horizon. In fact, the military was already preparing for the war in many ways. The U.S. Army's Hawaiian Department G2 Intelligence Section was looking for native Japanese speakers to fill their ranks as relations with Japan broke down. Arthur Satoshi Komori was born on the island of Maui and attended McKinley High School in Honolulu. While there, he and a classmate named Richard Sakakita were spotted and assessed by their ROTC instructor, Major Jack Gilbert. He later approached both men after they graduated with a job offer in early 1941. Komori and Sakakita enlisted into the U.S. Army's Corps of Intelligence Police, which was an early counterintelligence organization that was later reorganized and renamed the Counterintelligence Corps. They were perfectly suited for undercover operations against the Japanese. The two of them traveled to the Philippines, where they posed as sailors who had jumped ship in order to avoid the pending U.S. military draft. While there, they gathered intelligence on the activities of Japanese citizens in Manila. Arthur Komori even got a job at a Japanese newspaper office. He performed his undercover duties so well that he was eventually arrested by the Philippine police because he was caught raising a toast to the Japanese emperor after the attacks on Pearl Harbor and Manila. Arthur was still in jail when Japanese forces invaded the Philippines. In the chaos of that invasion, he was able to escape from prison and put his army uniform back on once again and made his way to the island of Corregidor, where he worked as a translator with military intelligence. After that, he was deeply involved in the fighting at Bataan and Corregidor. Arthur proved how valuable he was because he could cross behind enemy lines to collect documents from dead bodies and even capture prisoners to bring back for interrogation. When it was too dangerous to move ahead of friendly lines, or when the Japanese lines were very close by, he would sometimes write messages encouraging the attacking Japanese troops to surrender, insert them into small pipes, and then use a large slingshot to send them flying across no man's land into the Japanese ranks. Arthur made it onto one of the last planes out of Corregidor in April 1942 before it fell to the Japanese, and he escaped to Australia. But his friend Richard Sakakita didn't make it out himself. Richard gave up his seat on the flight to a Japanese-American civilian with a wife and child back in the United States, and he was subsequently captured by the enemy. I'll come back to his story in a moment. Well, as the only Nisei linguist available in the region in Australia at the time, Arthur's skills were in need everywhere. He conducted counterintelligence assessments and investigations, and even found himself working with Australia's Aboriginal population in the Northern Territory to help locate and rescue downed Allied pilots and crew. He then helped organize the newly formed Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, where he served as the non-commissioned officer in charge beginning in the fall of 1942. In late 1943, as one of the very few qualified and highly experienced Nisei linguists, he returned to the United States to pass on lessons learned to a new class of incoming linguists at the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Camp Savage, Minnesota. After he returned to duty in Australia, in true GI fashion, he married the first woman he'd met while serving overseas, a Chinese-Australian woman he'd begun dating the year before. In the 12 months between March 1944 and March 1945, Arthur was detailed to the Australian Department of Information, where he monitored and translated the broadcasts from the Japanese propaganda outlet Radio Tokyo. Although he'd been working relatively far from the front lines for more than 2 years by that point, Arthur never stopped thinking about his partner Richard Sakakita, who he knew was lost or captured somewhere in the Philippines. At the end of the war, Arthur was now a master sergeant and was present in Tokyo Bay as the personal interpreter of Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe, the chief of counterintelligence for the Pacific Theater, when the Japanese formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. After this historic event, he remained in Japan as part of the occupying forces until November 1945. While he was there, he learned that Richard had survived the war and even served to undermine the Japanese troops occupying the Philippines from inside a prisoner of war camp. Arthur finally returned home to Hawaii in late 1945 after nearly 5 years of undercover work, combat, and translation duties. After the war, he worked as a counterintelligence agent at Inawituk Atoll, which was a site for nuclear weapons testing. He also served as an instructor at Fort Holabird near Washington, D.C. Arthur finally left the Army in 1952 after being promoted to warrant officer and later first lieutenant. He earned a law degree and worked as an attorney in Hawaii for many years afterwards. In 1988, he and Richard Sakakita were both inducted into the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Hall of Fame at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. But Richard's story, as it turns out, is not nearly so straightforward as his old friend Arthur's. It's certainly true that Richard didn't make it out of the Philippines and that he spent much of the war at a POW camp. According to interviews Sakakita gave in 1955 and to his biography, which was published in 1995, he eventually gained the trust of his captors, which caused them to allow him more freedom and even use him as an interpreter for the other prisoners. Because of this, he was able to pass information to the wife of a Filipino guerrilla who came to visit her husband in the same POW camp where he was held. He also smuggled out Japanese Army uniforms and eventually led a team of guerrillas to free dozens of prisoners from Muntinlupa prison outside of Manila in August of 1944. For years after that, prominent Hawaiians campaigned for the Army to award him the Medal of Honor. Although the Army ultimately declined to award him the Medal of Honor, he received a Distinguished Service Medal for his conduct during the war, among several other awards. But some of the Filipino guerrillas themselves tell a very different story. None of the surviving prisoners from the camp or the rescuers who he says he led into Muntinlupa prison recalled his involvement in the prison break in 1944. One prisoner later reported Sakakita wore a Japanese officer's uniform, was housed in officers' quarters, and even slapped a captured guerrilla who protested against his own mistreatment. A U.S. Army colonel also reported that he'd seen Sakakita wearing a Japanese Army uniform just 2 days after the fall of Corregidor. Whether that was to blend in and escape, which is entirely possible, or for some other reason is unclear. Richard also apparently mixed up the dates of the prison raid in his biography, which was written by his own brother-in-law, by the way. He seemed to combine two separate events into one in the book. There was a raid on the prison by guerrillas in June of 1944, and then 2 months later, in August 1944, an internal prison break in which about 80 prisoners escaped. Richard's description in his biography makes it seem like the 80 prisoners escaped because of his own actions in June 1944, not 2 months later, as is documented everywhere else. So, many people think that at a bare minimum, Richard Sakakita was embellishing his own service and placing himself at events when he was far away. In early 2011, a man named Louis Jurica published a series of 2 articles which detailed his own father's service in the Philippines during the war. His father was Major Thomas Jurica, and he'd been born in the Philippines to an American mother and Czechoslovakian father before he enlisted in the U.S. Army as a quartermaster. Because of his extensive knowledge of the entire region, he was given a special mission to supply the Filipino guerrillas with exactly what they needed most to continue the fight against the Japanese. He even possessed a letter signed by General MacArthur himself to travel anywhere he needed to go to perform his duties as he saw fit. During the war, his mother, Blanche Jurica, remained in occupied Manila and even helped the guerrillas pass messages and resist the occupation forces. But she disappeared in 1942. So when Tom made it back home in 1945, he searched for his mother among the ruins of Manila. He couldn't find any sign of her anywhere, but eventually his search led him to Richard Sakakita, who'd been recovered by American forces but was being interrogated as a suspected collaborator. Richard broke the news to Major Jurica that his mother was dead and had been executed the year before as a suspected guerrilla. She'd been buried in the Manila North Cemetery in a mass grave with 23 other people executed the same day. Richard accompanied Major Jurica and a group of Filipinos to the cemetery, but they spent all day digging in one spot after another without ever finding the mass grave he'd described. Finally, according to his own writings, Jurica pulled out his 1911 and pointed it at Richard's head. He told him that if the next hole they dug didn't uncover his mother's remains, Richard would go in the hole. Sure enough, the next spot Richard indicated was the correct one, and the bodies were eventually all identified by dental remains or personal belongings that was buried with them. There's now a heroes memorial on the spot in the cemetery to commemorate all of them. Now, none of this was widely known in the immediate aftermath of the end of the fighting in the Philippines. After the war, Richard transferred into the brand new U.S. Air Force and served as an agent with the Office of Special Investigations. He retired as a lieutenant colonel after 34 years of service in 1975. He spent much of his career commanding Air Force agents in Japan and was repeatedly honored for his service in many ways. In 1988, he was inducted into the MI Corps Hall of Fame along with Arthur Komori, and an Intelligence Operations Center at Fort Lewis, Washington was named after him in 1997. 2 years after that, he was inducted into the Air Force Intelligence Hall of Fame as well. And as of the time that I'm writing this, there is no mention of any controversy over his record on the official Air Force website, on the Army's MI Hall of Fame website, or even on his Wikipedia page. Does that mean that the claims made by many of the surviving Filipino guerrillas and by Major Jurica are baseless? Or could it mean that most historical accounts are just a retelling of Sakakita's own words after the war? Like so many other stories I cover here, we may never know the full truth of what really happened all those years ago. The final question comes from Sean, who asked for my thoughts on the Netflix limited series, The Spy. This series debuted in 2019 and tells the true story of Eli Cohen, an Israeli spy who was incredibly successful in infiltrating the government of Syria and reporting back some very valuable information between 1961 and 1965. In the end, he was caught and publicly hanged in Damascus, but he's hailed as one of Israel's greatest heroes even now, nearly 60 years later. Eli was born in Egypt in 1924 to Syrian Jewish parents. His parents and siblings moved to Israel less than 2 years after it was founded in 1947. He remained in Egypt at the time because he was deeply involved in Jewish community affairs there. There are some indications that he received some training in espionage as early as 1955, but he wasn't officially recruited by the Mossad until 1960. By that time, he was living in Israel because he and many other Jews had been expelled from Egypt at the conclusion of the 1956 Suez Crisis. After intensive training, Cohen was given a cover identity as Kamal Amin Tabet, a Syrian Muslim who'd been born in Beirut, Lebanon, and whose father owned a successful textile business. They then sent him to Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1961 to establish his bona fides within the Arab expat community. The following year, he moved to Damascus, where he hosted grand parties at his home, complete with alcohol and prostitutes. He was soon socializing with high-ranking Syrian government figures. But despite his intended role as a sleeper agent, Cohen was pressed by his Mossad handlers to start reporting on the wealth of intelligence he was gathering. He began transmitting coded messages back to Israel almost every day, which put him at enormous risk of capture. For the next 5 years, he provided first-rate intelligence on Syria. One of his primary objectives was to learn everything possible about a water diversion project the Syrians were undertaking in the Golan Heights. They intended to divert the waters of the Banias River, which flowed into the Jordan River and supplied Israel with about 30% of its water supply. If those canals were completed, Israel would almost immediately suffer a serious and permanent water crisis. Eli provided enough information about the plans for the canal that Israeli warplanes were able to bomb the construction sites in 1964 and destroy all of the equipment being used, which effectively hampered the entire project. He was also able to arrange a tour of fortifications in the Golan Heights through his high-level contacts in the Syrian army. He not only learned where all of their fortifications were, but even suggested that the military plant eucalyptus trees around the earthworks, both to hide them from Israeli reconnaissance planes and to provide the soldiers with shade from the desert sun. His subsequent report provided Israel a major advantage during the Six-Day War in 1967 because they simply dropped bombs on all the eucalyptus trees, knowing that they had all recently been planted around the Syrian positions. After the war, Israel was able to take over about 2/3 of the Golan Heights and have held on to them ever since. It's an incredibly divisive location politically, culturally, and historically, but it's also of immense strategic value to both sides. Well, eventually Cohen's luck ran out when one of his transmissions inadvertently interfered with a military broadcast from a facility a short distance from his home. The Syrian military requested signals intelligence assistance from the Soviet GRU, who sent a team to the area to sweep for signals. That team soon determined that the broadcasts were coming from Cohen's apartment. On January 24, 1965, the Syrians broke into his apartment and arrested him. He was interrogated and tortured and eventually put on trial by a military tribunal. His trial has been described as a show trial with a predetermined outcome, but the truth is that he absolutely was guilty of everything he was being accused of. He was sentenced to death, and the Israeli government made a major diplomatic effort to prevent his execution. Several other Western nations also made appeals for clemency, and even the Pope made statements that Cohen shouldn't be executed. But the Syrian government went through with it, and on May 18, 1965, he was hanged in a public square in Damascus. His body was left to hang for 6 hours after he died, and a hand-painted sign was draped over his body for everyone to see. After that, he was buried in an undisclosed location. His body was never returned to Israel, and over the past 50-plus years, many covert operations have been undertaken to locate and recover his remains. In 2018, Mossad operatives successfully recovered his wristwatch, an Eternomatic Centenaire 61, after a 14-year operation to track it down and verify its provenance. Cohen is considered a national hero in Israel, and many streets and facilities are named after him. His memory is commemorated every year by the Mossad, and in 1977, the Prime Minister and others attended his son's bar mitzvah. He is still so important to Israel's national identity, in fact, that as recently as 2 years ago, there were serious efforts underway to recover his body. not just by Israeli investigators, but by the Russian government, if you can believe that. Russia has long had a very close relationship with Syria and has had troops deployed to Syria for many years now. In 2021, it was reported that they were trying to recover and transfer his remains as a means of normalizing relations between Syria and Israel. Russian troops spent at least 3 weeks digging in the Yarmouk cemetery in Damascus, where his body is believed to have been buried. They were also searching for 2 Israeli soldiers who went missing in 1982. At least 10 bodies were disinterred and set out for forensic examinations, which upset many people who had relatives buried in the cemetery, of course. But so far, Eli's remains still haven't been recovered. There are at least a couple of apparent liberties taken in the Netflix series with Cohen's true story, but I think everyone expects that from a dramatized TV program. For one thing, Eli is portrayed as a ladies' man while he was living in Argentina. He certainly had access to many women while he was there, and some reports say he had as many as 17 girlfriends in Buenos Aires. But after the series aired, his widow and daughter both made statements that this aspect of his life was pure fiction and that he'd been a devoted and respectful husband from the start. Now, it's certainly possible that his wife and daughter were simply not aware of that aspect of his life, which is something he would have very understandably wanted to keep secret from them, even if it was part of his mission and his cover. It's also possible that maybe they knew that to be factual, but didn't like having that portion of his life seen by potentially millions of people watching Netflix. So they just denied that it ever happened. I'm not really sure which is true. Another change for the series was the character of Dan Peleg, Eli's handler, throughout his career as a spy. Dan is played by Noah Emmerich, who is also very well known for playing an FBI agent in the FX spy series The Americans. He is terrific in both series, in my opinion. But Eli didn't just have one handler, he had several. And although none of their identities are publicly known, they recorded audio tributes to him many years after his death, which were uploaded to a tribute website, elicohen.com.il. You can hear them describe their feelings about him, and it's clear he was deeply respected by everyone who worked with him up until the end of his life. That's all the questions for the moment, but these episodes are pretty fun to put together, so I'm sure I'll do another one in the near future. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions this time around, and keep an eye on my Instagram stories for the next time I ask all of you to submit questions of your own. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my pages on Instagram at Spycraft101 and at cold.war.stamps. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.